Time to talk about the most mischievous person in all of Hunter x Hunter, Pariston Hill. Now, prior to making this video, I did a whole analysis breaking down Pariston's character, but because it involved pretty much the entire chairman election arc, that video would have been like 30 minutes to an hour. So I never ended up recording it because I figured it would be way too long for anyone to be interested. So I'll summarize everything we learn about Pariston in that arc. But if analyzing him in the chairman election arc is something people want to see regardless of how long it is, I'm happy to try to finish it up. But for this video, I'm just going to be talking about Pariston's involvement in the manga. Like I said, I'm going to start off by going over everything we learn about Pariston in the election arc. Pariston always tries to keep the same expressions and composure in order to constantly hide what he's truly planning. He's incredibly intelligent and is also able to predict and plan things 10 steps ahead of everyone else, as seen with him running circles around all of the Zodiacs and honestly everyone in the election arc. Everything is a game to him, and playing the game is the only thing he cares about. He doesn't try to win or lose. All he wants is the game to last as long as possible. And sometimes it seems like if Pariston doesn't have a good enough opponent, he'll almost compete against himself. He's a twisted individual with menacing, if not also hostile, violent, aggressive, and malicious intent. We know he's a Nen user because he's performed the use of Ren at least twice, and although it's hard to say how strong he truly is, it's important to mention that depending on the translation you use, Pariston has called himself weak, but what he truly meant by that is sort of up in the air, and I can get more into that at a different time. So his overall strength is completely unknown. However, I think a good way to view Pariston is that he's incredibly strong, but he fights with mental games before anything else, and assuming he does have an inability, it would likely take a very intense, complex scenario in which he would ever use it. But getting into Pariston's true strength is a completely separate video. Finally, Pariston loves taunting people and annoying them, and he acts very childish in that way. Another important part about Pariston is his more or less rivalry with Jing. Not only does Pariston see him as a worthy adversary, Jing seems to be the only one we actually see successfully keep up with Pariston's schemes, and he might even be a step ahead of Pariston himself. It also seems that Jing is childish similar to Pariston, in the way he likes to annoy Pariston and insert himself in Pariston's games, either looking for a challenge because he's bored or because he wants to annoy Pariston, or both. Jing seems to be a little too good at Pariston's game, leading to Pariston to dislike him, because his games don't become as easy when Jing's involved. And even though Pariston doesn't care about winning or losing, he does not like being out of control in situations. He might even feel uneasy if he can't predict what's going to happen. Lastly, there's two things I have to make sure you remember before I get into this. Number one is that Pariston basically told Cheadle that if she doesn't revise the Hunter exam, there's going to be trouble. And number two is the fact that somehow Pariston got his hands on and is in control of 5,000 Chimera ants that can use Nen. So, with all that background information out of the way, let's get into this. The chairman election arc was all just a game to Pariston. He made it last as long as he could and made it as fun for himself as possible. But after winning, he was bored and wanted to look for a new game to play. That's part of the reason why he gave the position to Cheadle. But the search for a new game is what likely led him to joining Beyond's personal crew, which is where we first see him again in the manga. After sitting and listening to Beyond's little speech about how badly he wants to explore the Dark Continent, Pariston is just calmly sitting with the same smile as always. And after reading into him so much, it's starting to get a little easier to read that stupid smile, in which this case most likely shows that he's excited about this new game he's playing. But also, whatever schemes he's got going on in his head, they're all likely going to plan so far. We also get quickly told that both Jing and Pariston have left the Zodiacs. The next time we see Pariston is when he's with the rest of Beyond's crew, and at this point in time, Beyond is at the Hunter Association. And then Jing pretty much just shows up out of nowhere. Jing is pretty much the one person who can really compete and even outplay Pariston. This leads to Pariston having a love-hate for him. He loves that he's a good opponent, hates that he can't manipulate and outsmart him like so many others. And that feeling towards him explains Pariston's weird, almost sadistic smile. He's excited his game just got more interesting, but a little upset that it's Jing because he did not see this coming. And like I said, he doesn't like things I he can't predict. Jing says to let him join their expedition crew because they're taking on newcomers. And like I said, Pariston didn't see this coming, or at least didn't expect it to happen so soon. So we see him go from a little disappointed or annoyed to putting on his game face. Pariston, as usual, taunts and jokes at Jing a bit. He says, "For a second I thought you came to stop us." And Jing just responds by saying that's exactly what he's here to do. Then the conversation kind of gets straight to business. And if you didn't remember about the Chimera ants, or that Jing knew about it, then this would come out of nowhere. But Jing says, "This whole mess is your specialty, a forced choice. Depending on how the Hunter Association responds to Beyond Speech, you'd send in 5,000 Chimera ants. You've had enough fun, haven't you? The association isn't your sandbox any longer. Don't mess with it anymore. I'll play with you personally from now on, until you beg me to stop." Now, this gives us some stuff to break down. First off, what Jing means by send in Chimera ants gets explained in detail later. So for now, just know Pariston would release the ants into the world. But Jing says that instead of using the Chimera ants to play a game, he'll entertain Pariston himself. Jing not only wants to likely stop Pariston from causing real trouble and harm, but also is ready to officially challenge him. I also think Jing sees this as something fun to pass the time, because his second objective is to freely explore the Dark Continent, and there's a lot of time between now and then. However, I do think it's important to say how Jing still directly steps in with Pariston because of the threat he posed to the world. So I personally wouldn't say this makes him heroic, but as you'll see later, I think that only really goes for your average, common, innocent people. I also want to mention that I think Jing likely spent the time between when he was in the election and now trying to figure out Pariston's plans and how to approach challenging him. It's also very important to mention the intense aura Jing is releasing, and it's definitely just a small taste of his full power. I think Jing is showing off his aura to do two things: show that he's serious about his challenge, and to taunt Pariston. I'd like to think that in a normal situation, Pariston and Jing would want to keep any clue to their powers a secret, and we do see this from Pariston throughout, and Jing for the most part. But Pariston loves challenges and obstacles, so by basically handing him a clue and deliberately showing off some of his power, Jing likely annoyed Pariston. He doesn't want any information handed to him. He wants to solve and predict things. It's also very important to see how Pariston isn't fazed by this at all. The fact that Pariston is unfazed means that either he's not intimidated by mere power, and or he's strong enough to not be concerned or affected by it. Pariston then says, "So you're finally gonna pay attention to me?" And when he says this, combined with his aura, you can tell that he's probably excited. And even though he doesn't like Jing, it's important to remember, Jing is essentially the only real good opponent he has, the only person who really challenges him. So that, and by seeing how serious Jing is, he's probably pretty excited. Jing then says, "Pay attention to you? We'll see about that. I might be just doing it for my own fun." And he's continuing to release his aura while saying this, likely continuing to taunt Pariston. And there's a few ways you can take this statement, but the way I see it is that Jing is basically saying Pariston isn't a big enough challenge, that his game with Pariston will be so easy he can fully focus on his second objective. But regardless of what you think he meant by the statement, it's all just to annoy Pariston, while also showing off his confidence and power. Pariston then asked Jing why he thought those were the only two options, and if those options still seem unclear, don't worry, they're about to be explained. But Pariston then kind of jokes by saying, wouldn't it be a much bigger problem if the Hunter Association just accepted their demands? But then from here, the fan versus Viz translations give me two different understandings of what Pariston is saying and possibly feeling, so I'm gonna go over both. In the Viz translation, Pariston pretty much says that if the Hunter Association just gives into their demands, that's not entering negotiations, and that Jing mentioning the Hunter Association and the Chimera ants came out of nowhere. Jing then says negotiations isn't even something Pariston is thinking about, and all he's doing is whatever he wants. He then asks Pariston why he didn't ask him how he even knew about the Chimera ants, and Pariston says it wasn't like I was trying to hide it, as he smiles. And this gives me the impression that he's pleased Jing learned all he could about him, that he's excited that his opponent is so good, that his opponent knows so much. However, for the fan translation, Pariston says, I mean, the Hunter exam coming out without even entering negotiations was pretty abrupt. And he either means it doesn't make sense to do the Hunter exam before figuring out their approach, or he means negotiate in terms of revising the Hunter exam, because he did tell Cheadle to revise the exam and soon. Then when Jing asked Pariston why he didn't ask him about how he knew about the Chimera ants, Pariston says, because you didn't seem aware of it. This is very different from saying I wasn't trying to hide it, because now it shows that Pariston is likely upset that his plan was found out so easily, and his smile is to cover up his true anger. And it also shows that Jing is able to easily hide things he knows and does from Pariston. I personally tend to go by fan translation because Viz has been known to mistranslate, and they also try to minimize how much text is there, which can be useful, but I feel like they tend to leave out important information. But either way, I wanted to share both interpretations. Jing then explains how Cheadle will accept help from V5 to help recruit personnel for the Dark Continent expedition, and they will then go to Kakin to the Dark Continent and try to contain Beyond while he's there, and Jing then implies that's what Netero would have done. However, Pariston disapproves of that entire line of thinking. Pariston says Netero would have never done that. He says Netero was a real hunter. He would have ignored V5's wishes and gone to the Dark Continent with his choice of hunters, finding a new and faster route than Beyond. Then once landing on the Dark Continent, he'd announce the hunt for Beyond is on. And he also says that that's what the Hunter Association should be. Jing then asks Pariston why he's trying so hard to destroy the association when he seems so obsessed with it. He asks if it's some twisted form of love, but Pariston asks Jing what proof he has that he's trying to destroy it, which leads us to learning what those two previously mentioned forced choices were. Jing says how he knows Pariston is always looking for a game to play, always looking for an opponent, and now that he's bored with the Hunter Association, he's off to find a new game. And the fastest way to start a new game is to scatter Chimera ants across the world, causing problems not only for the Hunter Association, but also the world in general. And at the same time, because the ants are considered a Dark Continent threat, if they came into the real world, the Hunter Association would likely be forced to change their stance on the Dark Continent being taboo. Jing then says that if the Hunter Association does show a backbone, Pariston would just end up sending Chimera ants to take the Hunter exam and they'd easily pass. However, he doesn't know what he'd do with a Hunter Association filled with Chimera ants. Now, to make those two choices more simple, basically option 1 is if the Hunter Association chooses not to let Beyond go to the Dark Continent, Pariston would start a new game by releasing Chimera ants into the world, with the hope that the association would then have to change their stance. Then option 2 is they allow Beyond to go, but split the Hunter exam from the association, allowing help from the government. And Pariston doesn't want this, so he would end up sending his Chimera ants to become hunters. It's also important to know that likely because of Jing's involvement in Pariston's game, Pariston never ends up doing anything with the ants, at least not yet. So you can let your imagination run wild with what would have happened if Pariston released the ants. Pariston then tells Jing that they're similar and both think in unorthodox ways. And Jing is just like, well yeah, that's why I think what I think. And he also calls Pariston a scumbag. Then once again, the Viz and fan translation give us a different look at how Pariston responds. For Viz, Pariston says, what a way to put it, but you're right, so whatever. Making it seem like Pariston doesn't care too much, and he's almost ignoring or shrugging off the fact that Jing figured out almost every detail of his plan. But the other translation says, wow, you really know how to lay into someone. That was harsh, but you were totally spot on, so no hard feelings. In this version, Pariston seems surprised that Jing figured out his plan, and is almost definitely upset by this. The important difference of these two translations is whether Pariston is upset that Jing read him so well. So either you take it that Pariston still isn't worried about Jing, or you take it that Pariston is realizing how much better prepared Jing is, and that he keeps getting caught off guard. And because I trust fan translation, and because of what happens later, I think think the second option is what's really going on here. But after this, Pariston explains how normal people feel happiness when they love and are loved back. But he feels happiness the opposite way. He feels happy when people hate him and feels the need to hurt the things he loves. Or in the fan translation, he says, when I'm hated by people, that's when I feel happiness. And I want to tear apart and inflict unimaginable harm to the things I love. Both have the same meaning, but one is far more descriptive. Then we see Pariston in a completely new way. He seems to be almost filled with hate and maybe even bloodlust as he says, but is that so strange? And Jing basically says that Pariston is insane, and that's how they're different. This statement is important, especially when Pariston previously said that they're both similar. It shows that according to Jing, he and Pariston both do what they want. They both play their own game and do so because they're bored. However, the difference between them is Pariston causes chaos and destruction with his fun, where Jing does not. Then one of the crew, Curly, asks if he can say something, but Jing's basically like, stay out of this, which causes another guy, whose name I believe is Usman, to walk up to Jing, yelling about him coming in, acting like he's in a position of power. But Jing grabs him by the shirt and hits him with the laziest but craziest combo ever. I mean, his face is destroyed. But turns out that wasn't real, as we see Jing's fist likely stopping right before hitting him. And Usman either saw what would have happened to him, just feeling the power coming off of Jing's fist, shown by the art and sound effects, or Jing used some Nen ability to cause an illusion. But I find that extremely unlikely. I think he just sensed what would have happened to him. And Usman is understandably pissing himself. And Jing just stares him in the eyes and says, got it, now stay out of this. This is a crazy change in Jing's character from how we previously saw him. Because we now know Jing doesn't care how strong or weak you are. If you're good or bad, he will not let someone get in his way. Now, how you interpret that is up to you. You could say Jing snapped because someone talked back to him, or maybe he wanted to assert dominance, or got in between him challenging Pariston. I think it's a mix of asserting dominance and mad that someone tried to step in between him and Pariston. But the point is, we now know Jing is basically ready to go at any time if someone impedes him. So just as a future thought, the second it's time to fight, I think Jing is getting right into it, regardless of who or what it is. And like I had previously mentioned, Jing's sense of heroism, or his sense of good, only applies to a certain type of person. Then something very strange happens. Jing senses something and he looks for where it is. He might not have panicked, but it was someone strong enough for him to need to know who and where this power was coming from. He immediately looks over at a corner and sees a crew member named Marion. And although she's a separate person, I think it's interesting that her aura has the same sound effect as Pariston's. But Jing asks Marion if she's in charge. But Pariston laughs and says that he's second in command, which then makes Jing say that it's not a hierarchy of strength. And this leads to something interesting that I get way more into during the chairman election arc. And it's that possibly with the exception of Pariston's actual Nen ability, it seems that he's actually weak, and the only thing he really has going for him is his intelligence. And this seems to be backed up here by Jing, who then says that if Pariston were only about brute strength, he could just easily beat him to a pulp. But if he did that, Pariston would just laugh as he choked on his own blood. So instead, he has to break his spirit, which I'd guess Jing will try to do so by beating Pariston at his own game. Jing then says he's now the number 2 and asks if anyone has a problem with it. Some crew members come out questioning his role as number 2 and ask what he brings to the table. Meanwhile, Pariston is just sitting back and watching, because here he actually probably knows how this will all end. And then both Marion and a guy named Masaru say that if Jing just brings pointless chaos, they'll have to fight him, and they both get in a fighting stance. And where Marion's just showing off her aura, Masaru has 3 shadows, 2 behind and 1 below, and this could be him activating whatever his Nen ability is. Although things don't escalate, so we don't see anything else. But just know that these shadows might have something to do with his Nen ability. Now, I'm gonna skip some stuff because it's all Jing, and this video is about Pariston. So in short, Jing convinces most of the crew to accept him as number 2 by offering to pay them double whatever Beyond has offered. But all other plans and rules will stay the same, it's just that now he's number 2. Towards the end of Jing gathering people to his side, he asks Pariston Pariston if he objects, and Pariston says not at all. And in fact, he says that he'd love for him to be number 2. Then Jing asks for his bank account to give him his money, but he says if he's correct, Pariston never accepted any money from Beyond because he couldn't care less about money, and Pariston says he's right. Then after this, Jing explains the 5 calamities and parts of the Dark Continent to the crew, and Pariston is just chilling somewhere else in the background. Why Pariston didn't attend this little lecture himself isn't explained or really made to be important, but you can see it as however you want. Maybe Pariston just doesn't care or doesn't want to be around Jing, maybe he already knows everything that Jing's gonna talk about, or even maybe Pariston feels that he's so strong he doesn't even need to worry about what's on the Dark Continent. But like I said, Pariston not being there is not made to seem important. Then some more Jing specific stuff happens, but I'll go over what's important from it. Some of the crew imply that they're not strong, but Jing says they don't have to lie, meaning they are in fact strong. This was already hinted at by his reaction to Marion's power, but Jing explains that if they were chosen to be part of Beyond's crew and each serve a specific and important purpose, there's no way they would be weak. And this shows how much Jing knows and how he understands not only Pariston but the whole crew. This is also more or less confirmed by Pariston saying, "This is annoying. We do think alike. Is that why I don't like him?" Pariston doesn't like Jing because, like Pariston, Jing is always reading and figuring out all there is to know about someone. He knows what people are going to do and say and how they'll react. Like Pariston, Jing is always 10 steps ahead, but Pariston is so angered by this because now he's the one behind. He's the one who's getting caught off guard, and it's his reactions and thoughts that are being predicted. He's annoyed because for the first time, he's the one being played. Then Pariston says, "As we're shown a sinister aura, so annoying. I might grow to hate someone for the first time in my life." When I first read that, I was like, didn't he already say he hates plenty of people? But then I remembered that's not what he said. He feels love when he's hated, but he didn't say he hates people. He shows his love by basically torturing those he loves. So this feeling of hate is completely new and also brings up possibly completely new reactions from Pariston as to what he would do to someone he hates. Jing then tells Pariston to tell the rest of the crew that he'll pay them double whatever Beyond is, and then likely just to be annoying, he says this isn't in order. And then with a background I see as representing nothing but Pariston's anger and hatred for Jing, he says he'll let his crew know, but he thinks to himself, I want to see what I want to do to someone I hate. I also think Pariston is shown looking like he's struggling to keep his signature smile. I think he's truly feeling anger and maybe even out of control for the first time. And if he shows his love by torturing people, I can only imagine what he'd do to someone he hates. And it's not like love equals violence, so hate equals love. No. With Pariston, love equals violence and hate equals even more violence. Then right now, because Pariston has some time to calm down, I want to make sure we're all on the same page about Pariston and Jing's relationship. At first, Pariston was excited by Jing because he was a good opponent, but now, after seeing how many steps ahead Jing is, and the fact that he can't outplay him like so many others, Pariston has grown to hate him, and through that says he's starting to hate someone for the first time. So now he likely feels the need to step up his game and try to get a step ahead of Jing. Now back to the manga. I think about a month passes and Pariston comes into the hideout saying that the hunter exam had just ended, but everyone sent to take it that was on Beyond's side were failed. He also explains that the new Zodiac, who's Kurapika, had a way to tell who was on Beyond's side and who wasn't. Then once again some stuff happens mostly centering Jing, so not much to go over, but one of the crew, Muir, explains that he along with others passed the lie detector test but somehow were failed by Kurapika, and he explains how if any one of them were told about the plan to break Beyond free, the Zodiacs could have found out. But Pariston laughs and says that they don't have a plan. Beyond will have to break free on his own and meet up with them later. Then some more stuff happens, but Jing ends up explaining how he has two goals. One is to help Beyond and will even break him free because he explains that he wants to freely explore the Dark Continent, but his second goal goal is to deter Pariston from causing destruction. And this statement makes Pariston give an evil glare. And it could be because the size of the space or slight changes in art, but I feel like this is an unusual representation of Pariston, which I think shows that he's sitting in his hatred and getting himself ready for the next round of their game. Then some random low-level crew come in and basically just say that either Pariston or Jing will have to leave because hierarchy stuff. Jing says there's actually 3 options, but Pariston says there's 4. And he also says, Jing is finally in the mood to do this. I wish he wouldn't interfere. And he seems to release some aura. Then Jing gives them the option to leave, and Pariston gives them the option to die. Both of them are not letting these random dudes get in the way of their game. Now, once again, because this is more of a Jing moment, I'm gonna skip around what happens next. The dudes start shooting at both Jing and Pariston. Jing is instantly able to figure out that they're emitters who conjure guns, and he prepares to use a Nen ability. And Pariston has a look that made me think 2 different things. One was that he's finally in a moment that allows him to see Jing's Nen ability, and he's essentially feeling like he can't mess this moment up. And by saying "are you sure" to Jing was a way to almost frantically hide that he wants to see it. And second is that he did intend to try to see Jing's Nen ability, but with how easily Jing was willing to use it, it's annoying to Pariston. Because once again, this is more Jing revealing information on his own, rather than Pariston doing something to figure it out. And if that's the case, then this is pretty much a continuation of how Jing is constantly doing everything he can to keep Pariston from having the fun he wants, all in an effort to slowly break Pariston's spirit. Then Jing says it's no problem if he sees, and he releases a series of punches which shock Pariston. They shock him because it's not Jing's ability, it's Leorio's. And for fun, I'll mention that Jing has the ability to copy and improve any punching ability he's hit with. But he specifies this is not a Nen ability, it's a talent he has. Jing then uses another variation of Leorio's technique in front of Pariston, who seems back to his normal self as he seems interested. I think he seems interested because what I assume he's thinking is something along the lines of, okay, maybe I didn't see what I wanted, but at least I'm learning something. Jing then explains that he knows Pariston had sent the men to attack them in hopes of seeing his Nen ability. And at the same time, he's pretty much disrespecting him by saying, next time you want to see my Nen ability, just ask. Don't get your men to play off a shitty script. More stuff happens and everyone accepts Jing's place in the crew. And Pariston congratulates Jing, who says Pariston can continue to lead the way he has been. But Pariston says he refuses, and he wants to see what Jing can do, or what he'll do. And Jing accepts the offer without hesitation. I think Pariston wants Jing to lead so he can take the time to make a move against him. Because whoever's leading will have to worry about that as well as their game, and Pariston wants all of his attention on beating Jing. I'd also like to point out that for the first time, it appears Pariston is rejecting an obstacle, because being the leader would split his focus. But for what seems like the first time, he needs or wants all of his attention on this one goal: defeat Jing. And sadly, that's the last of everything we've seen from Pariston and Jing. So as usual, let's go back over the type of person Pariston is after these chapters. The Pariston we knew in the election arc is no longer here. The way we understood and perceived him has almost entirely changed. Although he was annoying, mischievous, deceptive, and evil in certain ways, in his head, Pariston was always thinking clearly and outplaying everyone. But the election served to prove to Pariston that after Netero's death, there was no one playing against him that was a challenge. Then he was given the opportunity to take advantage of the Dark Continent expedition to start a new game with the Hunter Association using the Chimera Ants. However, Pariston's game was made impossible by Jing. Jing intervened, and not only did he force Pariston to play his game by his rules, he stopped and predicted every single one of Pariston's attempts to gain an advantage. Through that, Pariston is starting to feel hate for the first time. This hatred is likely clouding his mind and also making him unstable. He had about a month to prepare a scenario to try to make Jing show his Nen ability. Although you could say he wasn't really trying, I think that he's not able to think clearly, and that's why his plan was so easy for Jing to see through. Because with how smart Pariston is, I think it's more likely that Pariston isn't at his best, rather than Jing being almost exponentially smarter and more prepared than him. Although in terms of chapters it might be a while, I think Pariston is either getting close to snapping and he'll become more violent and aggressive, or he might be able to get himself together and gain an upper hand on Jing. But at the same time, I think it's very likely that Jing will keep the upper hand until they're on the new or maybe even the dark continent, and once they're on one of the continents, Pariston will give into his murderous desires and try to find a moment to attack Jing. But the most important thing to take away from all of this is that Pariston is feeling out of control and hatred like never before, and we should expect evil and chaotic things from him. And with that, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I'll say I got a few other videos in the work. I will eventually be going over Jing, Gyro, and the Zodiacs, as well as going over one of the most fascinating and craziest Hunter x Hunter theories I've ever heard. That'll probably be coming up soon. And finally, I've been asked to cover Kurapika's story and also the Succession War in detail, which I'm happy to do, and I will, but they're very long and detailed stories, so I can't say when it'll be done, but it will happen. But overall, I just wanted to give you insight to my future plans. As always, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments.